Yeah, good. So I'm going to speak about various aspects of carbon pricing, which is a kind of complex issue. People think carbon pricing is something that we all understand because we all know what prices are, we know what markets are, what taxes are. So everybody seems to have an opinion about carbon pricing, and sometimes that opinion is negative. But I think many people overlook the complexities of the research on carbon pricing and the many different arguments in favor of it, and also some of the wrong arguments against it, and some right arguments as well. So I will put everything together, talk also a little bit about other instruments, because at the end of the day, it's not just about how good an instrument is in an absolute sense, but how well it performs relative to other options that we have. So just to start off, it should be clear that the climate change presents us with an enormous challenge, an unprecedented challenge. And this graph by Tim Jackson already from some time ago just illustrates it. It shows different carbon intensities of production for the world and for some countries, but we'll look only at the world for a moment. That's the first bar, which says how in 2007 the average carbon intensity was of $1 produced around the world. And it's almost a kilogram, 3/4 of a kilogram of CO2 emissions. When I saw that for the first time, I was shocked. And we have to go to a situation consistent with 2 degrees warming. That's the limit agreed upon in Paris, maybe 1.5, which is a little bit more ambitious. And that means that we have one of these scenarios. And it can look more optimistic or more pessimistic, depending on whether there will be more people in the world and whether average incomes will be higher. So in the most optimistic case, we have to improve with a factor 20 to 36, this bar. In the pessimistic case, we have to improve our carbon intensity per unit of output with a factor of more than 100. That means more than 99% reduction for each output. And that's tremendous. So what we need is a very effective set of policy instruments. We won't do it with instruments that are a bit soft, that will try to change but are not very effective. We need very effective instruments. So I start with an overview, and we don't look in all the details, but this summarizes a little bit my view on all the policy instruments that we have available. And horizontally, you see the 4 main categories: carbon pricing, technical standards, adoption subsidies, and information provision and nudges. You could add a little bit more to that, but this clarifies it sufficiently, I think. And then we have various instrument criteria. So we can look at effectiveness, arguably the most important criteria, but of course, for political reasons and ethical reasons, distributional equity is also important. The economic cost is important, even though some people don't consider it as so important. It is important because a higher cost means more damage to the economy, more unemployment, more political resistance, etc. And of course, another issue which I will also speak a lot about in this lecture is that we need also to assess the potential of instruments to upscale globally and even to harmonize, because I will defend later that it will be very difficult to get very strong climate policies if not all countries do that simultaneously, because you see that in politics, for good or bad reasons, partly for good reasons, I think, there's a lot of concern about international trade effects, export effects of having strong policies in their own country, which are not being matched by equally strong policies in other countries. So what you see here is that carbon pricing performs well on all these criteria. Effectiveness is maybe clear. Distributional equity necessitates some explanation. Of course, it's often criticized, but the point is that if you have revenues from carbon pricing, you can use these to compensate inequitable effects. Economic cost is low because you select for cost-effective solutions, and carbon pricing, and that I will discuss later in more detail, is a simple approach that can be easily harmonized internationally. Standards score less well. For instance, they lead to a lot of incompliance, rebound. Look at the Dieselgate from Volkswagen. That's a good example of a standard that was introduced since many years and didn't work, and we didn't even know. It's crazy. And it's not only Volkswagen, it also didn't work for many other car brands. And in fact, even if it worked in the laboratory, in reality, it didn't work so well as in the laboratory. So there's a lot of problems. Of course, there's also a lot of lobbying here. Germany always resists very strong limits on car technology simply because they have these expensive car brands. Well, also, there are inequitable effects of technical standards, and there's no money being raised automatically to compensate for that. Adoption subsidies lead to a lot of rebound because they stimulate that people buy something, but if you subsidize, it's cheap, and then in the use phase, you use it more intensively. So you have to account for a lot of indirect effects that lower the ultimate effectiveness of the instrument. In terms of equity, it's not often discussed. It's not so attractive because it comes in the hands of the relatively well-off households. Well, I could go on. You see here green for information provision, positive, but information provision simply is not very effective. A lot of reviews and meta-analysis show that with information provision nudges, you can reduce emissions about 5–10% at best, not much beyond that. So that's too little to meet the enormous decarbonization challenges that we have. So I want to talk more about carbon pricing, an essential part of the solution. There are 4 classic arguments that are often recycled. They come from economics mainly, and I'm completely in agreement with those, but they don't convince non-economists often, and I understand that. And therefore, there are a set of other arguments which I will discuss later. But first, let's look quickly at these classic arguments. So a very important argument is that a carbon price or any environmental price will change relative prices in favor of the low carbon or the green goods, the green alternative. Holds for services too. It's not only goods, of course. Expensive holidays far away with a high carbon content will also be discouraged if there's a price on carbon. So if you make a gap between the relative prices of low and high carbon goods, you stimulate a move away from high to low carbon. What economists stress a lot is that carbon pricing and environmental pricing can deal with heterogeneous polluters and technologies. And it manages to select the cheap solutions and therefore equalizes the marginal costs. And that results then in the most cost-effective solution for society, for firms, for sectors, and that's politically attractive. Pricing also means decentralization of regulation. It's not that the government has to know all the information about technologies and costs within firms. It's also difficult to get that information because firms will lie about it. Will also always say that it's more expensive. And there's a lot of room for strategic behavior. And so there's low information needs, and that's nice. And a 4th classic argument is that a price on carbon will mean a permanent incentive for both technological adoption and innovation of low carbon alternatives. Because if this price is there, then firms will always be stimulated to look for ways to avoid paying the price. And in fact, the negative side of this is that if there's no carbon price, then environmental innovation and climate innovation trajectories will be misguided. And there's also a lot of evidence that prices play a role, especially the older literature on energy prices shows this very clearly. With carbon prices, there is evidence, but it's weaker because carbon prices are still low worldwide. So to clarify the cost effectiveness and the decentralizing, this is a classic graph from environmental economics, maybe the most important graph of environmental economics, which shows that if you have 2 technologies or firms with different abatement costs, and you would implement a uniform standard, which is easy, then you arrive at differential cost for the differential technologies or firms. And then there is room to make the one with the higher cost reduce emissions less and the one with the lower cost reduce emissions more. So finally, you would like to go to differentiated standards, ZA and ZB, which sum up to the same overall emissions reduction. But knowing where to put then your standards is very difficult because you would have to have knowledge as a regulator about the technologies and cost of A and B. And that is difficult to get. And if you're talking about 2 firms, it might be possible. But if you're talking about 1,000 or 10,000 of firms and many different sectors and technologies, yeah, then that's an undoable task, you know. You need a communist government to do that and to enforce that everybody supplies the right information. So there is a nice solution, namely a price. here a lambda, not a very nice symbol, a Greek symbol, but nevertheless, the price will make sure that reasonably rational cost minimizing firms will sit at these points which are consistent with these differentiated standards. I leave it here, but what's interesting is that you can interpret this in two ways. Namely, emissions reduction can be achieved against minimum cost, but that is interesting. That doesn't do the trick to convince many non-economists. But if you put it in another way, maximum emissions reduction for a given cost, that sounds already more attractive. You can do more with the same effort or money, and that means high effectiveness. Non-economists don't get excited by this very much, but they should not underestimate this, because future climate solutions will be tough and expensive, and their political feasibility will certainly be higher if we can minimize their cost. And it's also good to remember that cost is a broad concept. It means also more unemployment, for instance. If you go very quickly and with high costs to your climate solutions, you may do a lot of economic damage and create a lot of unemployment. But the arguments don't stop here. So I have a few other arguments, especially the ones in green here. And I will not talk about the others because of limited time. So the first is that with a carbon price on fossil fuels, where they come out of the ground or where they're imported, it's quite simple in a way. You don't have to control so many sectors. You indirectly control all the decisions in the whole economy. All goods and services will have, through cost calculations, prices that take into account all the emissions before in the life cycle production chain. And that affects both purchase and use behavior. And as a result, you have maximum control of rebound. And there's a lot of evidence now that rebound is serious. If you take the macro level rebound into account, I think the latest review shows that you have to expect it's more than 50%. So you would reduce your efficiency with 50% if you don't control for that rebound, and it's probably higher. Most emissions are in markets through market decisions, so price corrections are logical. Well, also the separate life cycle analysis is another option, but I think it's more easy to depend on financial accounting of firms that's well integrated, and carbon pricing will benefit from that. Well, the most important arguments here are related to the international dimension. We'll talk about that later. If you manage to harmonize policy through a carbon price internationally, then you limit carbon leakage. You also, with a carbon price, guarantee a minimal oil price. And that's also nice because this limits the so-called green paradox. If you don't control the oil price and you have all kinds of climate policies in place, then, for instance, subsidies on renewable energy, if they become threatening to fossil fuels, then the fossil fuel markets will respond by lowering their prices. And in fact, the prices of of fossil fuel markets have been fairly low since the Paris Agreement, and that might well have been a response of all these players in carbon markets, in fossil fuel markets, knowing that climate policy is on the rise, and they want to avoid that damages their sales. So they're willing to take a lower price into account and still have sufficient sales. So with a minimal oil price through carbon pricing, you can limit this effect, which is called the green paradox. And what's also interesting, it's not often said, if you have a carbon tax or a carbon market, you effectively shift revenues from OPEC countries to oil importing countries. And a lot of those OPEC revenues go to countries with excessively rich people. And these people support with their money football clubs. So even the high salaries like of Messi are supported by carbon emissions indirectly. We have to realize that. And these salaries will be affected if we have a carbon price. Maybe some people won't like that, but I personally don't mind that so much because these salaries are excessive. These people also have excessively carbon-intensive lifestyles. Another issue. Okay. And finally, also a very important issue, with pricing, you optimize the carbon emissions reduction and you spread the effort maximally over all players, wherever it's cheapest, through innovation, through investment, through purchase, through use. And as a result, you can reach the smoothest and least painful transition to a low carbon economy. It's easier to do it in other ways maybe, but that will do a lot of damage and create a lot of pain. So you hear a lot now about just and fair transitions, but I think carbon pricing can contribute definitely to that. So you would say many of these arguments are theoretical, but don't underestimate theoretical strong arguments are important because ultimately, also in political debates, arguments are what convince people. Evidence is something of scientists, but people are more convinced about arguments than about evidence. But of course, as scientists, we should also look at the evidence. And to the surprise of many, there's a lot of evidence for the effectiveness of carbon pricing. I summarize here some of it. It's not complete, but it's what I found interesting. So there are two studies by Bergh and Best et al. Recently that did very ambitious multi-country studies, and they both find that carbon pricing has a high effectiveness per unit of pricing. So Bergh finds that $1 increase in energy taxes reduces carbon emissions by 0.73%. That's fairly high. That's an elasticity of 7.73. Best et al. Finds a lower elasticity of 0.3, but that's also not so bad. They look more specifically and more widely over a longer period of time for between the countries that have carbon pricing in place and countries that don't have carbon pricing in place. And of course, they control for a lot of other factors. Then there's been a lot of studies about the effectiveness of the EU ETS, the emissions trading system. And it also finds that there is a serious reduction of emissions. So this is a study in PNAS, I think, a high-ranked journal. There's also a literature review that finds a lot of robust evidence. And finally, we should also not ignore the large literature on the effect of energy prices on energy efficiency, energy investments, and innovation. Famous studies by Popper, there's a lot more, and it finds tremendously strong effects of energy prices. This is important because ultimately carbon prices will directly affect energy prices. So it will always work through energy prices. So the effect on the research on energy prices is extremely relevant. Then there is a literature coming from well, social scientists who are critical of carbon pricing and also transition scholars who claim that carbon pricing cannot achieve deep decarbonization. Now, what's interesting, I am in some debates with people who feel like that, and they can never produce the evidence, but they require a lot of evidence for deep decarbonization if I say that carbon pricing is an important instrument in that respect. But they cannot deliver any concrete evidence. The thing is, of course, that deep decarbonization is something of the future. We will never have evidence before we try something. So it will have to rely on marginal effects, as I just showed in the empirical evidence, and on good theoretical arguments and probably also modeling of possible scenarios. Now, of course, economics offers a lot of that. But I again would like to stress that what is important is that a carbon price affects all decisions by all producers, consumers, investors, and innovators. Nothing escapes the influence of a carbon price. It's really the most systemic instrument you can think of to solve a systemic global problem like climate change. And hence, there will just be a critical price threshold at which you create so many change in the system that there will be a domino effect. And in the literature on climate change, a popular term now is tipping point, both in the natural science and in the social science. And I believe that there will be this critical threshold that acts as a tipping point. And some studies have found that critical threshold. Some studies say, no, if you have a carbon price above $200 per ton of CO2, then some modeling studies show then you will change everything overnight. The problem is, of course, to get political support for that. And it's likely that you will have to work with lower carbon prices and other instruments complementary to that, because that's just how the political system works. But I think people who believe in carbon pricing should not accept that. They should just say, we politicians accept now our expertise and the evidence, go for that high carbon price, negotiate it internationally, also to avoid leakage. This figure shows all the pathways through which carbon pricing affects the economy. And there are a lot of pathways, and this is probably not even complete.
Jeroen, sorry Jeroen,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. You have approximately 10 to 15 minutes maximum.
Okay.
Then we'll have more or less 20 minutes for
Perfect.
question.
Speed up a little.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luis. So of course, another debate is carbon tax versus market, and you have proponents and opponents. It's a difficult discussion because both have advantages and disadvantages. So ultimately, it's also an intuitive, subjective judgment. I tend to be in favor of markets more because markets combine effectiveness and efficiency, and the effectiveness guarantee is extremely important. And it also goes much in the direction of what people who want more radical approaches want. Caps on all kinds of things. Well, a market does it, but the cap has to be distributed in an efficient way. Otherwise, you can do a lot of damage to an economy if you don't do that. But what is also very important is that linking markets is fairly easy compared to linking taxes, and because linking taxes is hampered a lot by national tax law and the concern about who controls the revenues. But we've seen that markets are already linked in the ETS, and even non-EU countries are part of the ETS system. We've also seen linking of markets in North America, so that's just technically not difficult. And in fact, the only harmonization we've seen so far internationally of climate policy is through the EU ETS. So I know that some people are critical of that, but I'm very positive because of that. On the other hand, taxes have one main advantage, and that is that they create more regular revenue patterns. But carbon markets can also do that through auctioning permits on a regular basis, if you make permits not permanently valid. So, and of course, there are also hybrid system options where you have a price floor to assure minimal effectiveness, or a price ceiling to limit costs. And price ceiling means that if you go there, you effectively have a carbon tax. So you move from a carbon market to a carbon tax. And there is experimentation with these systems nowadays. The UK had very good effects of a price floor, for instance. Here you can see what happens if you have a carbon market. You fix the supply of permits, and if there is dynamics in the market, that's the nice thing of a carbon market, because there is technological change or demand change, new fashions, new sectors, for instance, more internet use and more energy and carbon emissions. Well, then the demand goes up and the price also goes up automatically. With a tax, that is sometimes more difficult. So a market absolutely has some advantages, I think. And also a market, once implemented, is so far away from politicians. You see that at the EU level. Politicians have completely accepted it, but taxes sometimes are reversed by new governments that are more right-wing and don't like carbon taxation. So taxes are always more sensitive to political winds. Just a note, it's important to realize that carbon taxes are not energy taxes or fuel taxes. And you can see that here if you look at energy, for instance, the EROI, energy return on investment, is an interesting indicator, but the EROC, the energy return on carbon, is a completely different measure. And we have to focus more on EROC if we are interested in carbon emissions and climate. I'm saying this because sometimes my students, they don't know the difference. One student who wrote a thesis on carbon taxation got the simple question, what's the difference between a carbon tax and an energy tax? And she couldn't explain it very well. But the carbon tax is more specifically focused on the carbon content of fuels and energy. And what we have to achieve, in fact, is convert all existing energy taxes to carbon taxes to make them more effective for climate. So with the same revenues, so we won't do a lot of changes, but we have to just do a test. What is the carbon content of energy and fuels? So there's a lot of resistance to carbon pricing in the social sciences. Many sociologists, political scientists, and geographers do not show enthusiasm. If you talk to them, sometimes they make negative statements. If you push them a little, then they will admit, well, okay, carbon pricing has some advantages, but they don't say that very enthusiastically. They tend to focus also more on equity and spontaneous bottom-up solutions rather than effectiveness. That's another focus. Economists are very much focused on effectiveness, but in other social sciences, that's not so clear on the perspective. And you see a lot of hopeful solutions. So people say, voluntary action should be respected and bottom-up solutions, but we know from the evidence that we cannot expect a lot from that simply. And there's no sufficiency proof. As I said, reviews and meta-analysis of information provision show that there's less than 10% emissions reduction at best. Also, there is now evidence from Sorrell and others that this goes along with a lot of rebound and negative psychological spillovers. So the systemic effects make it even worse. It's already small, 10%, and then it gets worse. Of course, a main criticism of critics is that carbon pricing has remained weak. But this holds for all the instruments that have been implemented. There is just not serious climate policy around the globe. Some people say that Sweden has strong climate policies and a high carbon price, but I will also criticize that later, you'll see. There is recently some evidence. There's this famous book, for instance, by Colin Ward and Victor, which suggests that we need an industrial policy. But I read the book and I find it all very vague, and there's no evidence, and they ignore lobbying power, rebound, leakage, life cycle effects, international harmonization. All the arguments that I think are important are just neglected. So I don't think they have a good alternative. And there's also a misunderstanding about inequity. It's still popular to say carbon pricing is bad for equity, but that doesn't recognize that carbon pricing generates revenues that can be redistributed, and they are in reality redistributed. And they can be redistributed especially to poor households for more expensive basic goods. And what is also forgotten is that many other instruments that are popular cause inequitable effects. For instance, adoption subsidies for electric vehicles or rooftop photovoltaic technologies, they go to rich households. Poor people often don't ever have a own house. They rent a house, so they're not going to put solar PV on their roof. And they don't have the luxury to think of electric vehicle. And we should also realize that adoption subsidies don't generate revenues, but do the opposite. They consume scarce financial public revenues. And also at the international level, it's important to have an automatic system of revenue generation and recycling, because if we want to go further with the Paris Agreement, we need a serious climate fund that transfers revenues from rich to poor countries. If every time that is a political debate, it's not going to work. If it's automated in an automatic revenue generating mechanism like carbon pricing, it can work much better. And there's a lot of writing now on carbon revenues. This is an interesting paper in Nature Climate Change, which looked at the evidence and shows that well, there's a lot of diversity of revenue use in different applications. There's a lot of green spending. Green spending is very popular, but there's also some revenue use for poor households. And they made an interesting diagram showing that depending on the local and the national situation, you may want to do different things, depending on resistance from sectors, if you have car industry or not, depending on whether there's a lot of support for regulatory policies or not, depending on whether people understand what green spending is. And so you can have different solutions. And this relates, of course, also to public opinion, which may be affected by the revenue use of carbon pricing. And what is interesting is that there is some inconsistency found among people's opinions there. So people express a lot of concern for inequity, for an uneven distribution of policy burden. But if you ask them how to use the revenues, they earmark them often for green projects, environmental climate projects, renewable energy. And it seems that that is partly because they don't understand really the difference between regulation and financing effects of a carbon tax or a carbon market. So many people think that the carbon price is meant to generate revenues to invest in green solutions. They don't see that the main role of a carbon price is to change behavior, the regulatory effect. And that's understandable because taxes in general are not meant to regulate, apart from some taxes that we have, for instance, on cigarettes and alcohol. Most of the taxes are meant to generate revenue. So that confusion is understandable. And also climate projects are overvalued, I think, in many studies and also in many public discussions, because climate projects suggest sometimes that government can do a lot about renewable energy, but that's not true. all big renewable energy projects are mainly coming from private funding, not from government funding. Sometimes it's suggested that cities even can invest a lot in renewable energy, but that's not true. There's little evidence for that. They do it sometimes, cities, but these are small projects, because investment in renewable energy is extremely expensive at the end of the day. So I could say more about this. Well, maybe, for instance, clever labeling is also important to create support, and that's why you see words like dividend, fees, reducing labor taxes, tax revision, and that's absolutely important too. What's also important that people understand that carbon taxes are not just a technical instrument in markets, but they also affect the social interaction of humans. So if you manage with carbon prices to change the behavior of some people through the regulatory effect, then other people will see that behavior and may also change their behavior through more social influences, because we're all sensitive. And many people are willing to go to a new technology if they see that a lot of that technology around them. Some people are risk averse and others are more early adopters. So there's a lot known about it, and that's why we did a study where we included a traditional economic model where people make decisions between high and low carbon based on income and prices, budget equation, but we also introduced dynamic preferences based on what happens around them. And then we can look at the effectiveness of carbon pricing, and we see that the effectiveness can go up much higher. So it can become 16 times higher than without social influence. And it depends also on the social network. So here you see different social networks. Some networks are more typical of internet, like scale-free networks with some people having a lot of attention, others less. Other networks are more relevant to the reality where people look at their neighbors, like regular networks. So you can also, based on this, think about network policies to even improve the effectiveness of carbon pricing, like adding complementary instruments like comparative information. What do the neighbors do? What do people with equal incomes do? Social marketing, awards for good behavior to attract attention, etc. So this paper was published in JEAM at the beginning of the year. It's a real nice study, I think, with one of my talented PhD students. So finally, something about the practice of carbon pricing. You may know this dashboard of the World Bank, the carbon pricing dashboard, which I just downloaded it today to update it. 64 carbon pricing initiatives of regional and national content. That's positive. Many countries show interest. Some people say there's no interest in carbon pricing. Well, that's just not true. There is a lot of interest in carbon pricing. Not only the ETS, which is a big experiment, but there are a lot of other experiments around the world, including in North America and China. But it's true, carbon prices are low and there's limited coverage of emissions. And I will say more about it in my next slide. And we need to move away from unilateral carbon taxes and markets, because the only way to have stricter policies is to cooperate more globally. This is a study I did with a student that is not published yet. It's on the review. And what we did is we transformed advertised prices that get most attention in the literature and in public debate to average prices. And for instance, you know that Sweden has the highest advertised carbon price in the world. But if you take into account that it's not applied to all the emissions and also that there are price discounts for different sectors, then you see Sweden's price drops tremendously. The average price of Sweden for all the emissions is much lower. And it's in fact lower than the average price of Norway and Sweden. And it's not so much higher than in many other countries. What you see here also is that countries that have a tax tend to have the lowest average prices. With an ETS system, a market, the carbon market gets higher. But if you have the combination, then you get the highest average prices. Here we compare implicit and explicit carbon prices. So the explicit carbon prices are the real carbon prices, but the averages that we calculated in green. But of course, there are a lot of other energy and fuel taxes in place that also affect carbon emissions, and these are captured by the blue. There are also averages. We also calculated the averages comparable to the green, and then what you see is that Sweden, just not to punish Sweden, but Sweden ends up in the middle. Sweden is not so special anymore. That may be due to two factors: that Sweden replaced a lot of its energy and fuel taxes by carbon taxes, and that's seen because relatively large proportion, half of all its tax pressure is through carbon taxes, which is relatively high compared to other countries. But it may also be that Sweden already has reduced emissions a lot in the past. It's also possible. But in any case, at this moment, the tax pressure of Sweden's carbon taxation is not so impressive anymore. And it's higher for Switzerland and Iceland and even Luxembourg. Luxembourg has a very low carbon price, but a high implicit price. And for instance, my country of origin, the Netherlands, also has a very low carbon price, only the ETS, but it has very high implicit carbon taxes. And here you see also how these carbon taxes and implicit taxes are distinguished between sectors. So road transport, as we know, has high implicit carbon taxes in Europe. For instance, that's a big difference with North America. And you see that carbon prices are a little bit more important in some sectors, especially electricity. And the evidence that I showed earlier also for ETS shows that shifts in electricity to low carbon and renewable energy have been also stimulated a lot by carbon pricing. And industrial, so that's what you want, but of course it needs to be much higher. So my final point is that we need to refocus Paris negotiations. Paris was an inevitable agreement at the time. It could not be better probably because there was no political support, but we have to move beyond it. We should not just talk about implementing the Paris targets, because that's not going to solve climate change. There's too much leakage and free riding. There will be a lot of leakage from countries with strong policies to countries with weak policies. So we should, I think, still try to negotiate a common policy. And that I cannot see another policy than a carbon price, not only because it's the best instrument, I think, but also because it's the easiest to negotiate, because it means you negotiate just one instrument. And you can start with a very low carbon price of 0. That sounds strange, but just the idea of a carbon price, and then increase it with $1 at a time and see how many countries want to join. And you'd be surprised how many countries want to join, because they can simplify their policy. They know, because of the harmonized instrument, that all the other countries will have the same policy in place, so that safeguards them against extreme trade and export effects. Weitzman has written a lot about that, good stuff. So you might look into this literature. And of course, if the price becomes significant, it also generates revenues, and then you can also talk about the automatic redistribution to the countries that need it and will be facing more difficulties to implement it. And of course, some countries will resist, notably the fossil fuels exporters, Saudi Arabia, Russia. So we need to do more. And therefore, I developed with colleagues a dual track transition, where we say, make a climate club or a coalition that can expand over time and interact with UN negotiations. And the motivation is that many other international agreements started as a club. The WTO trade agreements started as a negotiation among a set of countries. It was never a full agreement among all countries of the world. It's an experiment, and you can show to the rest of the world it works. You have a joint coordinated policy in the club. You can create political pressure at UN meetings. You can make joint pledges. You can also create economic pressure through a border tariff jointly on imports from non-members. And then non-members will have to rethink, I want to pay the tariff or I want to join the club. You can even return the revenues to the climate fund or directly to exporting countries to show your goodwill. And how to start such a carbon coalition? Well, important export partners would make it easier to avoid trade conflicts. The EU ETS would be a good starting point. The EU is already thinking about a border carbon tariff. And a multi-level club might be an option. If some countries don't want to participate, include some regions or cities, big cities. In fact, the US is now on a different track than with Trump. But I have a paper where I argue that if Trump would have continued, we might have included some Eastern and Western US states and big cities who want more ambitious climate policies. So to work this out, we have a scheme. I'm not going into the details, but if you're interested, you can read it, how the different tracks can build up pressure and ultimately integrate in a global harmonized solution. I don't think we can ever do it in a different way. I think we need to think in phases and building up pressure slowly. But I think pressure from a coalition that's growing is inevitable. And various authors have written before that, and they either focused on a carbon tax or a carbon market, but I think it can work with both. It doesn't select between those two.
Jeroen, sorry, do you have 1 minute?
No, it is really my final comment.
Thank you, thank you.
So my final slide.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my final slide, sorry. I want to clarify that I believe also in a climate policy package, as I said already. So here, this is based on a paper where we look at synergies, negative and positive synergies between instruments. For instance, it's known that energy targets at the European level conflict with the market. So you should not combine those two, because you just raise the cost. You don't reduce the emissions more. And therefore, here in this diagram, you can see different combinations of policies that can work. Carbon market should not be combined with standards or adoption policies. A carbon tax can be combined with an adoption subsidy. Well, for more details, you can see the paper. So I'm definitely in favor of a policy mix, but carbon pricing should be the core to it. And here are my conclusions, which I'm not going to read aloud, but you can read them, and if you want to see what I think is critical. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jeroen, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just also to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Just also to give a couple of minutes for questions and answer from your part as well. And thank you very much. The presentation will also be available on our YouTube channel. And I see that you also put here some publications that provide important information for the viewers. Thank you, Jeroen. So yes. Now we'll give the room for some questions from the audience. Let's see. Well, Ignacy is the first to raise his hand. So Ignacy, go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis. Thanks, Jeroen. It was a very, very interesting presentation. Lots of food for thought. I have a question about the issue of acceptance that we often find also in other areas of environmental policy in which we work more often, also related to environmental taxation. And often some of the arguments to increase acceptance relate to progressive introduction and also to the use of revenues. In that sense, in my view, it might be a bit easier with carbon taxes to set a kind of escalator of the tariffs that it has been done, for example, in landfill taxes, and it's somewhat more clear how to generate and use the revenues from carbon taxes than from carbon markets, where we have seen in carbon markets, or at least in some, a lot of volatility in the prices, and also lack, not completely or to some extent, lack of auctioning, which also means not really significant revenue from the public administration. I don't know if those arguments are relevant enough to push for carbon taxes rather than carbon markets, or are just questions that could be simply conceived differently in carbon markets to overcome those two limitations, so to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Ignacy. Well, I think we don't have to choose really definitely, because both experiments are undertaken, taxes and markets, and in Europe several countries have both. So it's fine to do both. I can see the argument that the revenue raising of carbon markets is more difficult, but it also depends on the design. And the EU, for instance, in its third phase, has now committed to several mechanisms to make sure that the prices are more stable and higher. But of course, ultimately, the prices will be higher if the ceiling is limited. And if that happens, then immediately there will be more auction, because there will be more trade, maybe less auction, but you can still make the validity of the permits more temporal, and then have a fee being paid in every new round to generate revenues. But it is true. I think the revenue issue is certainly more clear with taxes. So yeah, it's a difficult debate. What is more essential for political support? Is it the political international agreement among the instruments, which I think is neglected still a little bit in the literature, or is it the popular support of voters who are concerned about inequity? But as I said, these people say they are concerned about inequity, but at the end of the day, they believe that they should spend the money more on green projects. So there's maybe also some education to be done of voters, and that's yeah. Everybody should know more about what does carbon pricing and climate policy mean in terms of regulation, because it seems that there's still a lot of misunderstanding also among politicians about systemic effects, about revenue raising taxes, about regulatory taxes. Maybe I'm too optimistic. Maybe we have to deal with imperfect understanding of politicians and voters. But I have the hope also that we can educate people a little bit more, because I think it's necessary for solving climate change. It's not just that people become aware of climate change as an urgent issue, but that they also get informed a little bit better about what kind of climate policies can do the job, really, you know?
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ignacio. Thank you, Jeroen. Before going to the next question, Jeroen, you have another online talk at 1 p.m.
At 2,
right?
at 2, no, at 2.
At 2? Oh, good.
Yeah,
so
yeah, it's okay.
If you don't mind, you can also stay 5 minutes more.
Yeah, a little bit longer, maybe 10 minutes longer would be okay. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes. Thank you very much. So now we move to Veronica's question, and then Rosaria. Thank you.
Okay, first, thank you, Jeroen. It was a really interesting presentation and really inspiring. Sorry, I don't know. Yes, and yes, I work in ENT. I'm a colleague of Luis and Ignacio, and I think I'm not an economist and neither an expert on climate policies. But reading, I mean, hearing to you, I think you said one really good point and say that normally people get confused with carbon tax and an energy tax. And I think it was my case. But then when you start talking about the carbon content, I think that this could be applied to all the consumptions that we Indeed. Have. And then I'm more working in the waste management part or waste management project. And I think that there's a clear link between plastic and carbon. And actually now in the EU, there's like a lot of policies trying to improve or motivate to improve the market of recycled plastic. And then in Spain soon or at some point there will be a tax on virgin plastic. Then there is a potential of using this carbon pricing, but the direction it seems to go towards carbon tax, not so much about carbon market, no, related to plastic. And I wanted to ask you if you think that this is the right direction, and if it is, then I was thinking if we are doing these policies to motivate or to incentivize the use of recycled plastic, that more or less they have the same carbon content than the virgin plastic, then there will be some product that should be that this tax should not be applied. No, it's just how do you see the application of all these carbon pricing for plastic and to I see the potential to avoid to prevent plastic use, but then I don't know the potential on how to motivate or to incentivize the use of recycled plastic with this instrument.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Well, I think many people would say that a carbon price should not be levied on fossil fuels that end up as plastic unless they are burned. But I can also see that we should do it and then regard it simply as a co-benefit, that a carbon tax would discourage the use of plastics. So I think it could work perfectly. And a lot of plastics end up in incinerators, so they end up as CO2 emissions anyway. But if they end up as waste in the seas, for instance, yeah, that's also something you want to avoid. So it's difficult to say what would be a correct price for that, what is the damage cost of that. But if we have a low carbon price, I would in any case think it's fair. If it's a very high carbon price, you might debate it, but many people would say maybe the climate and the plastic problem are of equal magnitude. So I think it's interesting. What you said at the beginning, that the carbon price should make sure that all products are taxed for their carbon content. Well, that will happen, in fact. If you have a carbon price on all fossil fuels, then anything later in the production chain that will make use of those fossil fuels at any stage will see its price rise. And therefore, the composite price of a product at the end that goes to consumers or to other firms as an intermediate delivery will have a price that includes the accumulation of the carbon prices throughout the life cycle. So that price will be proportional to the emissions throughout the life cycle chain. And that's exactly what you, and no other instrument can do that. People don't see that, but that you cannot do that with standards, because you would need so many standards for so many products in so many phases. And these standards should be perfectly consistent. And if there's technological innovation, that standards should be adapted. Wow, that's undoable. I can just not see, I haven't also seen evidence for that, or even theoretical models that standards can do that. So I don't see an alternative for carbon pricing. But this is really thinking about how systems function. And I find the debate by people who are critical of carbon pricing very simplistic often. They don't think about that. They are not interested. As if a few standards is enough. No, if you have a few standards, then there will be leakage to products and sectors that don't have the standards or have weaker standards. Those things are difficult to see immediately. So you think you are doing a lot of good stuff, but you don't see all the leakage, you know. And that's also, I think, why we some people say, yeah, we've had a lot of standards and this and that, and it's working. Or maybe it's working locally, but we don't see the global effect of that. We don't see that emissions reduction has been significant due to standards also. So the evidence still has to come there. Well, I hope this answers your question a little bit.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jeroen. Thank you, Veronica. Just before moving to Rosaria, Veronica also mentioned if there was a possibility to differentiate the prices between the carbon price between a virgin plastic and a recycled plastic.
It's a nice idea. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
The thing is that if we look only into the carbon content, then both alternatives will have the same, let's say, no, because they are polymers with the same carbon. So if it's, I don't know how to define this difference. And I guess this applies to many things, no, that depending on, for example, the cycles that this product has done, this will differ. No? I don't know.
Well, but realize also that recycled or virgin plastics, like with aluminium, have different energy and therefore CO2 emission characteristics. So if there's a carbon price, a serious carbon price, yes, they will feel different incentives. You might have a shift to the version that is less energy and carbon intensive.
Yes, yes.
So if recycling leads to less emissions, then that will be stimulated also by a high carbon price.
Yes,
that's
yes.
Good.
I see your point. I see your point, because I think it's not the product itself that has the content. Like in this case, the content of the plastic bottle will have the same carbon content, but the life cycle stages upstream, because there are the collection, there is the raw material extraction, will have higher emissions associated. So this will be able to see it in the recycled plastic. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay,
thank you both. Now, Rosaria, can you please ask your question? Thank you.
Yes, Jeroen, thank you very much for your interesting presentation, really. I have a question regarding, especially yours last slide. You said that often renewable energy targets are opposite to ETS targets. So I would like to understand, so what type of configuration do you see considering renewable energy together with carbon pricing? Because I see many renewable energy projects that try to reduce emissions, but I don't know if there is any study that makes in evidence the real impact that renewable energy project can give compared to carbon pricing. So I don't know if my question was clear.
Yeah. Well, it's not so much renewable energy projects, because they might be stimulated by both carbon pricing or targets. But it's just that at the European level, we have both the targets and also adoption subsidies in some countries, and carbon market. And if you have adoption subsidies and targets selecting for expensive options that are not triggered by the price, well, but then you shift in the carbon market basically from cheap options to expensive options. But you substitute the cheap options by more expensive ones. Why would you want to do that? That doesn't make sense from an economic perspective, and you don't increase the emissions reduction either. So this has now been shown empirically and theoretically for many regions around the world. It also happens, for instance, in the US and in Europe, maybe also in some cases, because there's national legislation and there's state legislation, all with good intentions, but they sometimes work against each other, or they frustrate each other. And yeah, that's sometimes you can simply have too many instruments. From control theory, you should say, if I control the problem already, I should not add instruments, because it's just going to frustrate the control. Apart also from the fact that legislation and control also has an administrative cost. But this insight is quite well supported. There's a lot of people who realize it now. It's a little bit more subtle, I should say, than I say here, because in the paper that's been accepted in climate policy, which I'm waiting for the proofs, I can send them to Louis. He can. I'm really happy with this paper. I did it with my whole ERC team. It's a paper with 8 authors, and my co-authors are young students who are more critical than the reviewers, in fact. So we really did a good job, and we tried to convince each other, and it was not easy sometimes. So it's a little bit more subtle and more complex than what I summarize here, but that's with summary sometimes. Yeah. So you'll find it interesting, but it goes broader than the previous papers on synergy, which I didn't find impressive, I must say. A lot of people say policy mix is important, but the most important reason is because there's positive synergy or zero synergy, but complementarity. And we should look also at how big that synergy is, and if there's negative synergy risks. And we should look at many instruments. So we for instance, we included more information about information provision and nudges, which has also been lacking in this literature. And interestingly, that's not always positive synergy either. It's a little bit more complex as well. So this is still something that needs a lot of research, I think, but there are interesting insights. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you, Rosario, and thank you, Jeroen. I have a question, but I will still give time to anyone in the audience to raise his or her hand if there are more questions. Well, it seems no, there aren't. So I have 2 questions, but I will start for the first one, and I think that we leave it there because we are almost getting on the time proposed. So in your opinion, Jeroen, what are the main barriers to this international policy coordination regarding carbon pricing? It is true that, as you showed in the figure, that a lot of countries have their own instruments, and we also have the ETS, but still there's like in other kinds of policies, there's a lack or difficulty to coordinate globally, and we're running out of time, right?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it has to do with path dependence. The negotiation in the United Nations framework on climate change, they went in a certain direction, and at a certain moment the ambitions were put very low, and then they came with this solution after some failed international COPs, these conference of the parties, where tens of thousands of people fly to a city to negotiate. And they decided, well, let each country just have its own pledge, its own target, and we don't care. And then we call it an agreement. And that happened in Paris. In Paris, they had clearly the idea, whatever we have, we call it an agreement. And that's it. I'm a bit cynical, I know. And I was one of the earliest people who on Twitter wrote a more cynical tweet, but everybody was positive, but I didn't see it so positively. And now I think all the judgment that I give a lot of credit to of the Paris Agreement is quite negative. I mean, with Paris, we're going still to 4 degrees warming, I think, maybe more. But my best guess is 4 degrees. They say 3 degrees, but it doesn't include rebound and leakage. And with rebound and leakage, it goes to 4 degrees, I think. So we should move away from the path dependence, and it's very difficult because I think politicians, new politicians are educated by old politicians. So they believe this was good and this is still good, what is happening there. And also I feel that experts are lacking in these negotiations. The role of experts should be more, and that's difficult. Maybe scientists will always call for more attention. So I am quite pessimistic. So I think that the initiative should come from countries that have equal ambitions, maybe are also export partners. So within the EU, something could start. If Biden, for instance, Biden has spoken about carbon border tariffs also. If Biden would be willing with the EU to make a first carbon coalition, that would be great, carbon pricing coalition. But he also has to embrace carbon pricing, because in their country, they talk also a lot about the new Green Deal. And I'm personally also very critical of all these Green Deals, which are a little bit blah, blah in many cases, because the regulatory policy is very weak in these Green Deals. I understand that they talk about that, but they should talk about carbon pricing, honestly, more. Or very strict standards, but I don't see that either. So my hope is a coalition outside the United Nations negotiations, and that will then ultimately in the United Nations negotiations put also more pressure on the other countries. But I'm not optimistic. I'm not optimistic at all. No, I'll say.
Well, thank you very much, Jeroen. Before closing, I will ask you also to share with the audience what is the best way to follow your work. Is it through ICTA webpage or your Twitter account? Can you please tell us?
That's a good question. I have a website, but it's one of these websites from the university where all the publications are in green open access, because we're obliged to do that now. Green open access means it's not the original paper, but it's a version of the paper that was submitted as the last revision to the journal, you know. But you also have the link to the journal. So either you go to the journal there. So I'll send that website to you. Yeah, I think that's the best connection.
Can you share it in the chat account?
Well, I can also do that. Yes, please. I can do that.
And while you do that, I'll also say a couple of words here. Once again, thank you very much, Jeroen, for being here. It was a real pleasure to see you again and to hear you in this very interesting talk. It was a pleasure for me and, of course, for ENT as the organizer of these online talks. Also, thank you very much for all the participants for being here today. Please follow our work at our webpage, ent.cat, as well as in the social networks and YouTube channel where you can find these and the previous online talks. And we will have more talks in the future. So